Our speaker tonight is John Ubelaker, who received his BA and MS degrees from Kansas University and his PhD from Colorado State and postdoc from Emory before joining SMU, Southern Methodist University in Dallas. At SMU, he directed 24 students for master's and PhD degrees and obtained over $1 million in funds for research projects. He served as chair of the biology department and director of the Fort Berglund campus for 16 years before retiring to Taos. I don't know if you know, the Fort Berglund campus is owned by SMU, and John ran that for 16 years, so he's intimately aware of everything that goes on there. He's written 9 books and book chapters and over 100 scientific articles. And tonight he's going to talk about Cleome serrulata, Rocky Mountain beeweed that was used by Native Americans. Some people call this Rocky Mountain bee plant. Some people call it bee weed. John's going to call it whatever he wants. Take it away, John.
Well, thank you very much. And as I go through the material, if you have questions, raise your hand, interrupt me. It's perfectly okay. I'm used to that, so just let me know how I can make it more clear. Mariela Gomez is a young lady who has worked with me on this project. She has worked, She has worked very well and is a real contributor to this project. We have just submitted this manuscript and it has been accepted. So it's going to be published hopefully within the next several months, I hope. But Mariela lives down the street from me. She's a Native American young lady. She has a great interest in native plants. She has worked very strongly in the past, primarily working with monarch butterflies and the milkweed plant that they need to survive in this environment. And she has contributed greatly to that project. When she was, and she did most of this when she was in grade school. And as a result of that early grade school experience, I asked her to give a talk. And when she was in the 8th grade, she gave a presentation of her work at the garden club. And it was a very successful, great lecture. Unfortunately, she could not be here today. She just graduated from high school. She's going to attend a college in California, and her parents have just left to go out there to check on the housing and that sort of stuff. But she was a great contributor to this project. Cleome serrulata is an annual plant species. It's incredibly common here, and it's a plant that's kind of on the decline, primarily with the advance of the other kinds of plants that have invaded this area, and particularly sagebrush has been one of the plants that's kind of really pushed it out of existence here. So it's been a plant that's kind of on the decline. But at one time, if you drive out toward Hondo and look out on both sides of the road, you see these huge fields of sagebrush. At one time, there was no sagebrush there. Sagebrush came in about the 1930s, but it was a plant that this plant occupied those entire fields and was very, very distinctive, very pretty, and very common. Again, this common plant that was here was used often by the Native Americans who studied it, understood it, and used it in a variety of ways. And they used it not only as food, as a treatment for illness, to make dyes for clothing, and for painting on locally made ceramic pottery. And I'm going to discuss these aspects with you this evening. Next slide, please. Again, here is an illustration of Cleome. It's a beautiful plant. It has 3 very common names. Beeweed is one of those, or bee plant is one of those. And another name for the plant is skunkweed. And another name for the plant is spiderweed. And that reflects the variety of features associated with the plant. Again, on top of the plant, with the flowers, one can see the little stamens and pistils extending from the flowers, which gives it a spider-like appearance, hence that common name. And again, it is a plant that has leaves that are very distinctive and, again, smell very strongly. So strong that they repel insects from feeding on those leaves. And then again, after fertilization, they produce a seed pod that quite long and filled with a single layer of these very distinctive seeds that also form a very important component of their life cycle, allowing them to be easily transmitted when the seeds fall from the plant to the ground and germinate the next year into another series of plants. Next slide, please. Now again, the flowers attract bees, all sort of pollinating insects to them. Also really attract hummingbirds. And again, that skunkweed name suggests that they are producing a strong, smelly chemical that's repelling insects from feeding on the plant. This is a plant that is widespread throughout this region. It occurs from about Albuquerque north, and this is the region here. It's where it's probably the most common. It's very common here. And again, it's being replaced by the sagebrush today. But it was a common plant observed when the first Native Americans moved into this area. About the year 1000, a little bit before the year 1000 or so, when Native Americans first came in here, they found fields of this plant and just literally discovered it and really fell in love with it. Next slide, please. Again, when we see the plant blooming, the slide's a little bit on the side here. But fields of this plant would occur throughout this region and were very important because they attracted so many bees to the plant. Hence the common name beeweed or bee plant. And again, we have a hummingbird here, but those hummingbirds sometimes scare away the bees. And if the hummingbird wasn't there, we would see probably 20 bees on this plant, on these plants here. It would have been very, very common. Next slide, please. Now, these specimens are very common. Over at Fort Burgwin, we find them all over the place, and they are very commonly collected and identified there. And they have been identified there for the last 30 years. They're coming up every year, and they're very common. And our students collect them and press them and put them in our herbarium there. And they can be used for studies from year to year to see how the plants are doing. Now notice on the plant itself that as the plant grows in one season, it grows with a very elongated root that goes very deep into the ground. And as a result, it survives so well in this kind of dry, arid soil that we have here because that root goes so deep and can keep moisture going to the plant. But it's a very, very interesting relationship that the plant has to its dry environment. Next slide, please. Now, use as a food. when Native Americans discover this plant, they know it has a very strong smell, and to kind of get rid of that smell, they had to cook it. And they would collect the plants and literally boil the plants a little bit in order to get rid of that smell and make that plant edible. Again, the Franciscan fathers reported that the plants were often made into a stew. And so once that these plants had been boiled, the smell disappears, and you could literally drink that fluid as a stew or mix it with other kinds of meats or other products to make a stew. And it says that this stew, used in this way, often is reported to have saved the Navajo from starvation. So it was a very, very important plant to these Native American communities. With medicinal uses, the fluid from boiling these plants, if taken, when one has stomach problems, the stomach problems appeared to disappear, appeared to go away. Again, Yakrafria, Tiwa, boiled the leaves, ate the leaves, and again, it was used primarily to control any sort of stomach problems that they might experience. Again, taking the leaves that are boiled and putting them on your eyes when you have eye infections appeared to clear up the eyes. Again, the often used soak leaves as a way of treating various kinds of skin diseases too. Not only the eyes, but skin diseases. Again, it is commonly used if an insect bites you, a mosquito, or a black fly, which is coming soon. When the fly bites you, very commonly take one of those leaves and just put it on the bite, and it takes the irritation away, removes the irritation from the bite of those insects. Again, in Oregon, Native Americans used those plants to reduce fever, lower fever, and again, it was also used in various ceremonies to provide good blood to the individual and also to improve their voices when they're doing their chanting. Very commonly here at the Pueblo, before many of these chants take place, this is a plant that they would normally take some of this fluid from to make sure their voices are very clear and can extend across the environment in a very distinctive way. Again, this was a frontier medicine. Once the Native Americans discovered these properties, and again, Spanish Americans who learned about its use from Native Americans also used it to decrease inflammatory reactions of the body. So it had great medicinal features that these early Native Americans learned about when they started examining this plant in detail. Next slide. Now again, bee wheat was very commonly collected in the summer, and those seeds were collected in large numbers and saved for use in the winter. The seeds have a very high protein content, and if mashed up, can be made into a bread, and you can eat that bread all winter long. and it was a good source of good high protein in winter months. But again, this plant was so important because it was so easily traded between other Native American groups that did not have access to the plant. And so it became a very important trade item for these Native Americans. And again, it could be traded to East Texas, to the Pueblos of Zuni, again. And in order to make these trades, this plant had to be collected in large numbers, and it had to be stored so it could be used for these trading, as a trading item. Now again, Ann Woosley, who's an archaeologist that worked at our camp at Fort Bergwin, was one of the individuals who recorded in the archaeology work done at Pot Creek, recorded that the domestic and wild plants collected by these Native Americans there included pinyon pine, the pine seeds, pumpkins, yucca, beeweed, beans, sunflowers, and corn. And when Native Americans discovered that this plant would attract so many bees as potential pollinators, the Native Americans started collecting these seeds and mixing the seeds with the major plants they were trying to grow for consumption, the three sisters, which are, what are the three sisters? Corn, beans, and squash. Okay? So they would take these seeds for this plant and mix them with these other seeds from these other plants to attract pollinators, to make sure that their corn produced more product, got more benefit from the pollinators. So in a way, we might consider this beeweed, if you will, a maybe the fourth sister, maybe in that way. But again, this was a very important plant, and it had a very important function in allowing these Native Americans to produce an agriculture in which they really depended on. But they could grow these crops because of this beeweed that attracted the pollinators to make sure that it could produce enough of each product. Next slide, please. Now, in order to use these plants and able to use them as food was obvious, but they discovered that when you boiled this plant down to make food, and you boiled the plant for several days, that material, that fluid, would get lower and lower and become more concentrated with the product from the plant. And as you boiled that material down, it would turn a darker color. And that darker color kind of attracted their attention. Maybe we could use this darker color as a dye. And they discovered very commonly that if you spilled some of that heavily boiled down fluid from this plant on your clothing, it would turn kind of black. And they began using this plant to color some of their clothing. You want dark black shoes? Boil that plant down and dip your shoes in it, and they would turn black. So they discovered that if you boiled the plant down and made kind of almost a paste out of it, it was very useful as a dye to use for various kinds of plants. Now, in order to use this dye, they had to figure out a way to apply it very carefully to their clothing. You couldn't just dip your shoes into it and make them all black. But if you wanted this little black stripe on your shirt, you had to find a way to put that on there in a very precise, easy way. And they all used yucca leaves to make the brushes to put that dye onto the clothing, and as we'll see a little bit, eventually onto the pottery. The yucca species around here, there are two species. Yucca ubelacata, the banana yucca, and the soapweed yucca, Yucca glauca. And these are two very important plants used by the Native Americans here. Again, there are 40 species of yucca, and all are pollinated by moths at night. The flowers are large and white, and it's a moth species that pollinates the plant. Again, the female moth collects pollen from a flower and rolls it into a sticky ball. And then she lays usually 5 eggs into the base of the flower. And after laying those 5 eggs, she takes that sticky ball and puts it on the outside of those eggs to kind of hold them into the base of the flower. And then the pollen fertilizes the flower, of course, and gets pollen on her, and seeds are produced. She takes it, she goes to the next flower, does the same thing, spreads that pollen from flower to flower at night. And after 2 or 3 or 4 days, the larvae emerge from the seeds, from the eggs, and the larvae chew on some of those seeds, some of those 5 seeds, eat a couple of them, and then the larvae crawl out of the flower, fall to the ground, and go underground for a year until the yucca forms flowers the next year. And when the flowers start forming on the yucca a year later, they crawl out of the ground, metamorphose into flying moths again to fertilize the flowers. It's an intricate relationship between the yucca plant and the moths that pollinate it. It's a very precise, interactive relationship there that's almost hard to believe. How a life cycle of an insect could be modified so much just to feed on this particular flowers of this plant. Again, the seeds from the yucca that are released into the environment fall to the ground, spread by the wind to other environments, take 3 years to grow back into a plant before flowering again. So it's a very intricate relationship that these yucca species have. Next slide, please. So, again, there are these two species of yucca, but I want to point out a very important feature of these two species. Number one, look at the size of the leaves on these two plants. Yep. Large leaves, very thin leaves. And the Native Americans now realized that they could make several different brushes from using leaves of different sizes. And again, leaves from both species were used commonly to make the brushes used in painting this dye from the bee weed onto not only their clothing, but also into their pottery. Next slide, please. So, making yucca brushes. How was this done? Well, literally it was done by cutting off a branch, a leaf off this yucca plant, cutting it off to a length that you could manipulate very easily, and then biting off the end of the leaf, and then chewing the end of the leaf to make a very fine little brush that could be used to pick up this dye from this boiled plant and then paint it onto your clothing or vessel, etc., to make a line, a black line. And this was commonly used by all of the Native Americans living in this north central region of New Mexico. And that is still continued today by some Native American groups. There is a wonderful book called Living Traditions of Maria Martinez. And in this book, she describes how today her family is still making bee weed dyes and taking yucca leaves and making the brushes to apply to the pottery and to designs on clothing. So it's a practice that's still being used today very commonly. Next slide. So again, you can see the difference in the leaf here. Small, thin leaves, bigger leaves. And all of these then would have to be looked at carefully to see what size of the brush you want to make to apply this dye to pottery or clothing. Next slide, please. Now, at Pot Creek was occupied from about a little bit before the year 1000 until the year 1300 approximately. And it grew from the first individuals that moved in here, living in very below ground pit houses, to bind together as groups to form a pueblo. And that pueblo is on called the Pot Creek Cultural Center today. It's a Pot Creek site located on our campus. And again, these individuals living there had to grow, I'm going to say the four sisters, and had to grow food, store it for the winter to last them through the winter, and to trade with other groups. And they had to make the pottery for saving that material. And again, when we look at the pottery that the archaeologists have recovered from Pot Creek, we find that that pottery has a very elaborate painted scheme of incredible variety of patterns on these pots. Again, once that material is added, painted onto the ceramic surface of a pot, and the pot is fired, that material turns very dark black, as you can see on the illustration here from this water jar that has been collected at Pot Creek. But when we look at this, the pottery has an incredible variety of designs on it. Imagine boiling a weed down, making a black dye, making a dye out of it, taking a yucca brush, chewing off the end to make little bristles there, dipping it into that dye, and now painting it on to the surface of a ceramic vessel. Look at the designs that are present here. How intricate can that be? Designs that are incredibly fine, thin lines. To larger designs, to another mosaic of lines. But look at the very thin lines going between these regions here. All done with a yucca brush. So to make a design like this, I can't imagine how many brushes you'd have to make to do a design like that. You'd almost have to have a separate brush with a separate surface bristles there in order to make all of those very complex designs and lines that are in that pottery. It's absolutely incredible when you see the incredible designs that were actually produced in this way. Next slide, please. Now, I'm going to show you some of the pottery that has been collected by the archaeologists working at the Pot Creek site. And again, this pottery is from about the year 1000 to about the year 1300. These are very old pots. And all of them have a variety of designs on them showing how complex this system must have been. Again, in this two lower examples, you see there's a few little designs around the outside, but some of the pots we covered there are absolutely beautifully illustrated. All made with these yucca leaves. Absolutely intricate patterns, allowing very distinctive patterns, maybe related to families. Maybe a family would make one design, another family another design to identify the family. But of the hundreds of pots recovered from Pot Creek, all of them have this very distinctive design associated with them. Next slide, please. These are some of the pots recovered, again by archaeologists. And again, these are pots that are covered over with dirt as these houses kind of were washed away and moved down. And these pots were all covered up and excavated by the archaeologists. And again, some of them have some broken parts on them. And I might add that of the 100 or so pots that have been recovered from there, there are thousands of broken pots discovered, found. Yes?
I think earlier you said they made pots to transport the seeds. Were these particularly used for the seeds, or they're just
Well, they were probably used for storage. Yeah.
any type?
Of any type, yeah. Yeah. Yes.
I was just wondering about the size of those pots.
Well, I'm going to show you some that are this big around.
Okay.
These are smaller ones.
Okay.
But again, I want to point out the incredible design on the surface of these pots made from this beeweed and how intricate some of these relationships are. When you look at the complexity of these lines, I couldn't do that. I mean, it's absolutely a great skill to be able to make designs of this sort. Now, this top one up here is probably more easily done. This one's probably a little bit more complex. This one's a little bit more complex, but look at this one. That's absolutely incredible that you can make that kind of design with a yucca brush. Yes.
Did they use them for cooking?
They use them for cooking. They use them for storage. They used for bringing water in from the stream. I mean, they were used in a variety of ways. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Next slide. Oh, yes.
So, did either of you, probably not you, it sounds like, but did either of you try to duplicate this process where you boil down the beeweed and then get the stickiness and then try to use it on fabric and pots and things like that, just out of curiosity?
I have not, but in Maria Martinez's, she does that today.
Okay,
Yeah. She still does it today. Yes. Yes.
I did.
You did?
Right.
Back when I was developing, took it over from Ty Minton, Freddie Bowers, who's doing well, by the way, in the Zoe Garden these days.
Stand up.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a fellow named Ty Minton who began developing the native plant historical cultural garden at Millicent Rogers Museum 18 years ago. I think other people were involved too. I got involved about 9-10 years ago in retirement and picked up where he left off. And beeweed was very high on the list of plants to cultivate in the courtyard historic garden there. And the State Department of Cultural Affairs runs an archaeology event at different parts, I think annually or every 2 years.
Every 2
around
years.
the state.
Mm-hmm.
And about 6-7 years ago, it was hosted at Millicent Rogers, and there was someone with a booth that was describing this process and showing the paint. So I was successful eventually, that's a whole nother story, sometime about cultivating it, which was not easy. There was a few tricks I learned if you want to know them. But anyway, so I made some. I took a Dutch oven, put it on my gas grill, and I was advised to use the entire plant.
Right, correct.
Root, stem,
Root,
flowers, seeds,
everything.
the whole thing, and boil it for 24 hours. And it boils down to a dark brown soup.
Right.
And I didn't go painting any pottery from there. Actually, they were doing some at the archaeology. They had some already made, and they were painting pottery pieces there. One detail is it comes out a very dark brown,
Right.
but it's the firing
That makes it
that
black.
turns it black.
Right.
And if
Yeah.
you go to Millicent Rogers, Gallery 4 has several pieces of polychrome mid-Rio Grande Pueblo pottery, which has the black as well as other colors.
Mhm.
And the big plant was used to
Exactly.
produce that. So it can be done.
I would have wanted to try it.
Oh yeah, I played with it. I had a Pueblo drum, or kind of a cheap version I got at Taos drum down the road. So I made a painting on it using the paint,
Oh, okay.
and it was brown
Brown.
because it wasn't fired.
Right. Yes.
So Richard, boiling something for 24 hours, a lot of moisture evaporates. Did you keep adding
No.
water to it?
Or you can, but it's also good just to boil it down to make it kind of a thick
Yeah,
solution out of it.
It was fairly thick, but it wasn't really viscous. I
Right.
was adding water, yes.
Yeah.
But with the lid on the Dutch oven,
Yeah.
imagine,
Yeah.
barbecue, backyard gas grill, it can be done. Have fun.
Okay.
Well, I know why you probably did it outdoors.
Yeah.
Because it really does, it's not a pleasant smell.
Yeah,
No.
while it was cooking, you're right.
I
Yeah,
was
it's back on the patio, right.
Yeah.
Next slide, please.
Exactly.
Well, again, if you want a more detailed description of how all of this is done, her book is just marvelous in explaining the detail of not only boiling it down to make the paste, but how to apply it, how to make the yucca brushes, etc. And it is a very distinctive volume, and it's book's relatively cheap to purchase if you want to purchase one. Next slide.
There is no next slide.
No, that's it.
Is that it?
That's it. Do you have any questions about material? Yes.
I'm sorry I missed the beginning. I thought it was on a different location, but I used to grow, I'm probably gonna say it wrong, Cleome on the East Coast in planter boxes.
Right.
It
Mhm.
bloomed, it was fantastic. Is it the same plant?
There are several different species, right? And so Cleome serrulata is the one that only occurs here,
I see.
and it was used by Native Americans in that way. But there are several other species and that are commonly used in grown in gardens. But this was the one that makes the black dye.
I see, and the one that supports especially our pollinators.
Correct. Yes. Yes.
I have great trouble growing it. Do you have any pointers for how?
Okay. We're growing it in great detail
I'm not
right
an
now.
expert, but I've had a lot of experiences that I'll share with you. I don't have a botany degree like John. So I really wanted to grow it, both at home and at the Millicent Rogers Courtyard Garden. And you can buy commercial packages of seeds.
Right.
I've seen several sources, catalogs. I
Yeah.
even have a vague memory of noticing them on the rack at Petrie's once.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. I failed to grow it out in garden land, either there or in my own backyard. Typical garden soil arrangement with a variety of native plants. What happened is a large pottery urn, it took very well in the sun in the courtyard at Millicent Rogers. That was an accident based on just the design of what was available in the sun, not in the shade. Secondly, I got 2 half wooden barrels. I've reproduced the same thing at home. That was 5 years ago. They like to be in contained spaces.
Yeah.
It's grown well. It reseeds itself every year.
Right.
It likes water, so keep it watered, and you don't have to do anything else for it. I'd use ordinary potting topsoil mix, and it grows and annually reseeds itself. And it spreads. It's
Yeah.
coming up all over my yard now.
Exactly.
In gravel,
Yeah.
in all sorts of places, and it'll pop up.
Exactly.
Yeah, I planted one plant on the west side of my house that I bought from the Native Plant Society greenhouse probably 15 years ago. And over time, it has spread. It's now on the east side of the house.
Yeah.
I saw a little sprout today, very distinctive seeds, kind of 3 leaves.
Uh-huh.
And it's gone, it just goes here and there. Some years I don't see it. If there's no rain, you don't see it.
Yeah.
Last year, it just boom. And this year, I think it's gonna do the same thing.
Yeah.
There's a big field of it. If you drive around town in some of the fields on Salazar Road near the Habitat for Humanity,
Right.
wasn't it last summer? It was a whole field full of them.
On the
Just gorgeous,
same
get yay high.
Which side of the road?
The
On the
west side of
same
the road.
side as.
As a habitat, yeah.
Okay.
One of those empty lots, but either before or after that, yeah. So once you have it, and you got about 15 years to go, you will eventually see it.
If you do Sarah Bush's studio tour, Taos studio tour, she's got tons of it, and every year she gives away little seed packets. It's
good, yeah.
The other trick to propagation is that it doesn't like to be buried. So if you bury it like a typical seed,
Right.
it's not going to come up. It needs to be on the top. That's why it does soil and gravel.
Right.
If you put a little bit of sand to keep it there or just let it go, the best thing to do is do it in the fall. Just sprinkle seeds
Right.
out.
That's right.
And it just goes crazy.
It
Yeah.
goes crazy. You
Yeah.
don't have to do
And
anything.
full sun.
Full sun.
In full sun. Yeah. Yeah. Well, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.